Um, Today I'll be speaking about a paper based on a temporary art installation that was put on in 2019 at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. The objects on display were made by a group of second and third generation Japanese Canadian artists whose families were interned by the Canadian government during World War II. Before discussing the art in the exhibit, I'm going to provide some historical context and then go through and discuss some of the main themes that were observed. So following the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the Canadian government began imposing restrictions on all Japanese Canadians. Japanese language newspapers were shut down and the government began liquidating businesses and impounding Japanese fishing boats. This was relatively easy to do since it was widely believed that those who naturalized in Canada only did so to obtain a fishing license. Even those who had adopted what might be seen as Canadian traditions faced discrimination due to the saliency of their ethnic identity. Beginning in 1942, over 22,000 Japanese Canadians, mostly from British Columbia, were evacuated and interned in the name of national security. While this internment initially only targeted Japanese men who the government perceived to be a threat, it soon expanded to include women and children, many of whom were born in Canada and were second and third generation. In August 1944, Prime Minister Mackenzie King announced that following the end of the war, Japanese Canadians were to be moved east past the Rocky Mountains in an attempt to clear British Columbia of all Japanese Canadians. Those unable or unwilling to move were assigned to be what was called repatriated to Japan, and in 1946, the organized deportation of Japanese Canadian families began. By the time this policy ended in 1947, approximately 4,000 Japanese Canadians had been deported. It was not until April 1st, 1949 that the restrictions on all Japanese Canadian movement was lifted and families were allowed to re-enter parts of Canada. For many Japanese Canadians, the internment and relocation process had not only stripped away their homes, but also many of the cultural practices that had been a part of their identity for generations. Children were no longer taught to speak Japanese and were encouraged to marry outside of Japanese families. Since many Japanese Canadians feared that speaking out against this process would legitimize the Canadian government's anti-Asian rhetoric and create further anti-Japanese sentiment, this chapter of Canada's history was allowed to fall into silence while an entire generation lost touch with a part of their identity. It took until 1988 for the Canadian government to acknowledge these events and issue an apology for the actions against Japanese Canadians. So I'm going to spend the remaining of the time speaking about the exhibit and some of the objects that were on display there. As I mentioned, each object was created by a different Japanese Canadian artist and represents the artist's memories and emotional ties to a painful and fragmented past. On their own, each of these objects represent individual memories, but together they help you structure a collective and unified narrative. Before discussing the art, however, I want to discuss the actual layout of the exhibit. First, as I mentioned, this was a temporary exhibit, which is symbolic of the temporary nature of memory and by association identity. Further, and I'm actually unsure if this was done deliberately or just because of pragmatism due to space, the objects were placed within a permanent exhibit depicting the French and English settlement of Canada. This, I do argue, is important because it contrasts these temporary objects with the permanent colonial narrative. I argue that it helps remind the visitor that the official history of Canada is a white settler narrative and that many still feel the negative impact of colonialism. Reinforcing this is the fact that these objects that were made by these Japanese Canadian artists are scattered randomly throughout the exhibit, creating the feeling of a marginalized and dispersed population. The image that you see is a sculpture made by a Japanese Canadian artist, Masarin Matsunaga, entitled Continuum. The sculpture is divided into 3 layers, each symbolizing a different chapter of his family's history in Canada. The bottom layer, with its bright and colorful imagery, symbolizes his family's immigration to Canada and is filled with hope for a better and brighter future. His Japanese past is represented by his family's roots, which are symbolically wrapped around the outside of the sculpture. The second layer, in contrast to the first, is darker and devoid of hope, thereby representing the internment and relocation of his family. Trapped behind barbed wire, the roots of his families are darker and shriveled as these restrictions imposed upon Japanese Canadians prevents them from growing. The residual wire travels into the third layer, which is representative of the present, and continues to restrict the artist as he feels the impacts of the restrictions and ensuing naturalization process. The background to the third layer is a field of poppies with a crying face showing the artist's dual Canadian and Japanese identity, lamenting the past. The poppies symbolize Canadian remembrance, and therefore his Canadian half, while the face represents his Japanese half. Once again, the roots are completely absent from this layer, having been destroyed by the internment and naturalization process. Finally, the figure atop the sculpture is a traditional Japanese figure representing hope for future generations. Thus, this one sculpture tells the story of loss, remembrance, and hope, as the artist seeks to transform his family's history into a piece of living art. The next piece, which is entitled Canadian Born, was created by Lillian Blakely, a third-generation Japanese Canadian. After the war, Blakely's family lost their home in Vancouver and were forcibly relocated under the War Measures Act. Having lost their fishing boats and livelihood, Blakely describes how her parents were forced to find work farming sugar beets in Alberta. The woman in the picture is the artist's mother, standing smiling in the middle of the field. Behind her, a Canadian passport establishing her Canadian identity is overlapped with a crooked maple leaf, symbolic of the broken promises of the Canadian government. Again, the barbed wire is present, representing the restrictions imposed upon Japanese Canadians during and after the war. If we look at the top section of the piece, we notice that the eyes of the artists are looking down in reflection at her mother, both in sorrow for what her family had to do so that she could live here, as well as it is representative of the fact that a part of her identity has been forgotten because of her mother's silence about the past. Whenever the artist would ask her mother about the past, her mother would simply smile and say a common Japanese phrase that roughly translates to, "It can't be helped." By shouldering the burdens of her past, the mother continued the tradition of silence, leaving the artist feeling disconnected from this past. Thus, this painting is a form of reflection and recall for both artist and viewer, creating a window into the past as we continue to be propelled forward by its influence. The final piece, entitled Interior Revisited, shows the internal conflict that artist Norman Takaguchi feels. Takaguchi remembers having to relocate with his parents, feeling ashamed of his Japanese identity as a child. The painting, which is fragmented and chaotic in nature, symbolizes his internal struggle to reconnect with his Japanese self. The painting is split into two halves, each half divided by an empty black void, which represents the silence and selective amnesia that occurred after the war. On one side of the divide, we see multiple figures dressed in colorful Japanese garment. On the other side is a figure understood to be the artist standing in front of the Canadian Rockies. Unlike the Japanese side, the Canadian half lacks color and emotion as the artist seems to blend into a homogeneous gray background. The lack of color is meant to symbolize the loss of individuality and identity that the artist feels that would otherwise allow him to stand out against the homogeneous Canadian narrative. In summary, each of the objects in this temporary exhibit tells different stories of hope, betrayal, and loss, and helps to recall pieces of a fragmented past. However, in order to understand this past, we also must understand the context that led to this loss of identity and, by association, memory. Without this understanding, these objects lose meaning and become another example of a lost and forgotten history. Currently, these objects help to fill empty pockets of time created by generational silence, transforming static moments of history into living memory. But to keep these moments alive, we have to actively engage with them and to have a desire to remember. For without a desire to remember, there can be no memory, and without memory, there is no identity. Therefore, I want to conclude with the argument that by viewing these objects, we assume the responsibility as the keepers of memory and identity for the second and third generation Japanese Canadian artists whose families were wrongfully interned by a government that promised to protect them. I want to thank everyone for listening, and I look forward to answering any of your questions during the Q&A.